The Gospel according to John, the 20th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
And as we continue to kind of get used to this new lectionary style where we're moving through the Old Testament right now, so we have one long reading that is the focus of our day, and then they have given us a short gospel lesson to go with each one of those. And this gospel lesson happens on Easter Sunday, on the evening after Jesus has risen, and the women have seen him, and all of those things, but nobody really still believes it all, and they are in the upper room, and Jesus appears even though the doors are locked. And towards the end of that evening, we hear in verse 21, Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." The gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
I invite you to be seated. So again, as we move through these stories of the Old Testament, 2 weeks ago you heard Len talk about Moses at the burning bush and the calling of Moses to be the leader of the Israelites and bring them out of slavery. And last week with Pastor Mike, you heard the story of the Israelites out in the desert and starting to complain because they had no food, right? And God provided bread, manna in the morning, and meat through the quail in the evening. And so those are the stories that we have heard most recently. And now we move all the way to the first book of Samuel. And we missed an awful lot of the Old Testament stories. And if we continue with this lectionary, which I hope to do, it's a 4-year process. So every year we'll kind of get different stories through the Old Testament. But they'll be in chronological order, but they'll just jump like this story. We won't get this story next year or any of the next 3 stories. But so these stories that I'm mentioning that we missed, we'll get to sometime in the next 3 years, I'm sure. But some of the stories that we missed, we left them in the wilderness with the manna and the quail. We left them before they got to Mount Sinai and received the 10 Commandments from God. What a great story that we will hear at some time. And fortunately, we missed the whole book of Leviticus. We didn't have to read, thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that, and this is an abomination and that's an abomination. So we missed the whole book of Leviticus. We missed the whole book of Numbers, which, is another fun one. It talks about how many people there were and who followed who and all of those kind of things. But the book of Numbers spends an awful lot of time also with the story of the Exodus. There are actually 3 different books in the Bible that spend most of their time with the Exodus. Because the Exodus was the biggest story, the biggest part of the life of Israel from the time of Abraham to the time of Jesus. And for Jews today, the Exodus is still the biggest story in their history. So there are several books, obviously Exodus, but Numbers also has an awful lot of stories of that time of 40 years in the wilderness. And then the book of Deuteronomy. We missed the book of Deuteronomy. We missed Moses' last moments with the Israelites, guiding them with God's guidance through the desert all the way to the other side of the Jordan River, just across across the river from Jericho. And so we haven't heard the story of Moses and how he praises God and gives instructions to all of those new generation of Israelites who were not born in Egypt, but all of the people that he's addressing were born in the desert during their trials and tribulations through the desert. And we would hear the story of Moses' death, and then we would hear of Joshua. And Joshua rising to be the next leader of the Israelites, the one to take them across the Jordan River, the one to take over all of the land. It starts with the story of Jericho, and the great story of the walled city and the strong army ensconced in that city of Jericho, and the Israelites walking around and around and around the city, and finally they blow their trumpets and God knocks the walls down, and the Israelites begin their conquest of the promised land. And we missed the book of Judges, where the Israelites were needing leaders. And God didn't want to give them a king like every other nation had a king. He gave them judges, people to settle disputes and things. And the most famous of the judges is Deborah, a female. Imagine that. Even in the Old Testament. One of the stars of that time of Judges was Deborah, and there's a great story about her, and I'm sure we'll hear that in the coming years. And then we also miss the great story of Ruth. Ruth, a widow who traveled to the other side of the Dead Sea with her 2 sons, because there was a famine and she was widowed and her sons were young, and she had family over there in Moab, and she went and she settled there. Short story, but I'm not going to tell the whole story. I just want to hear the whole story at one point. But on that, the young men died, or they married and they died, and Ruth is going back. Not Ruth. Naomi, thank you very much. Naomi is going back to Israel, and she tells her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to go back to her people. And Ruth has the great line, I'm not going back. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. One of the great stories of the Old Testament of faithfulness within family, and faithfulness to each other in the presence of God and in the glory of God. And that brings us to today's story. Today's story really should begin at the first chapter of Samuel with Elkanah, a regular, ordinary Israelite who traveled the specified times to the city of Shiloh, which I said is where the tabernacle was. And they did their sacrifices, and they paid their tithes, and they joined in fellowship with all the people that came to be there at those great high holidays. But Elkanah was nothing really special. He had 2 wives. One's name was Hannah. The other one was Peninnah. That's what I'm going with. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Peninnah. Peninnah had many children, and Hannah had none. And we learn in the first part of Samuel that Peninnah, it's like junior high kids. She was always teasing Hannah about, I've got kids and you don't, nanny, nanny, nanny. Making Hannah feel horrible. Hannah wanted children, and Elkanah wanted children for her. But she just was barren, couldn't bear a child. And so you heard me tell the kids, prayed and prayed and prayed, and she prayed that if God gives her a son, then her firstborn son will be given as a Levite to the church. What a loving, for most of us, impossible gesture to think about. Giving our firstborn son to the church and really never having a say-so in his upbringing. It says that every time they would travel to Shiloh, she would bring him a new coat that she made for him. But that was the extent of her being in his life. And so Samuel, her little boy, is growing up in the church, working and doing whatever. We don't know how old he was. We don't know if he's... How old is that kid there? 10? 11? We don't know if in this story if Eli is 6 years old or 15 years old, but he's still young. We're told that he doesn't yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord has not yet come to him. We hear that the word of the Lord has not come to anybody for quite a while. You see, Eli, the chief priest, had 2 sons who were also priests. And the 2 sons were thieves. They were crooked as crooked could be within the church. They were stealing from the money, from the tithes. They were stealing. There's a story about, people would give their sacrifices. They'd bring the lamb or the goat or the ox or whatever they sacrificed. And these 2 sons would send their strong-armed men and take like half of the sacrifice and say, you have to give it to them or you just have to, or we're going to do harm to you. And they were just as corrupt as could be. And Eli half-heartedly tried to get them to quit stealing from the church, but not without much success. And so we have the middle of the night, and young Samuel is asleep. And he hears those words, Samuel, Samuel. And he says the words that we have heard from others. In Hebrew, it's ELCA. Here I am, Lord. But he says it to Eli. He thinks it's Eli that's calling him. The old man, the priest who can hardly see. The one that he really is being raised by and trained by. And he runs to him and says, what's up? What can I do for you? Nothing. Go back to bed. I didn't call you. Happens 3 times. Finally, the 3rd time, Eli finally gets it. Maybe because he hasn't heard the word of the Lord for a long time, he doesn't immediately realize who it is that's calling Samuel. And finally he says, it's the Lord that's calling you, my love. Go and lay down again. And when he calls, say, here I am, Lord. I'm yours. Speak to me. And this is the call of one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Samuel grows to be the one Saul and then anoints David, and we have an awful lot of his prophecies written down for us that we can share with each other. So this is the start of all of that. But the start seems to be a bit dangerous to this young man. A bit off the wall, because he's to go tell Eli, his mentor, his master, his grandfather figure, if you will, that he's in deep trouble. That God's not pleased at all with him or his family, and that God is going to cut them off not just at the knees, but at the neck. And that Eli's family is not going to continue in the historic passing of the high priesthood from father to son. That Eli's family was going to be cut off at the neck with these two corrupt sons. And that was Samuel's first prophecy. Not how you would want to start your career as a prophet, but it's what God called him. And he got up and he did it. And we hear in the reading that Dean read for us that Samuel grew up and everyone knew that he was the spokesperson for God. And that he was an upright man. And that he was one to be trusted and to be followed. And that's the story that we have today. That's our history lesson for today. But I ask myself, so what? History lessons are nice. Ryan tells me he loves these history lessons. But so what? What does it do for us today? What can we learn from this story of young Samuel, living at a time when the church is as corrupt as it can be, and being called as a young man to be a new leader within that church? We learn that God never, ever goes back on his promises. We learn that in this story, God is doing a new thing. We hear law and gospel in this story. We hear the law that the two sons of Eli and Eli himself are breaking the law, and that there's consequences to breaking this law. And these consequences are going to happen. And we hear gospel. We hear good news that Samuel is called to be the new voice for God. We hear that God calls and uses people who have no idea that they're being prepared to be called by God, to do God's work. We hear it over and over again of how God calls the ordinary to do extraordinary things. But you know what? God also calls the ordinary to do pretty ordinary, godly things. When we think about people who are called today, called to some position or some activity, or when we think of people as called, certainly we probably think of pastors. because when we're looking for a new pastor in a church, we have a call committee, and the committee gets together and decides if we're going to call this pastor to be pastor of our church. And the call committee gets together with the church council, and they work out all of the details. And then we offer that pastor a letter of call. And when you talk to a pastor, every pastor I know has a story about our calling. When it was that we knew that we were called to be a minister of word and sacrament, to be somebody that could stand up in front of a group and tell you about the love of Jesus and the incredible love of God and those kind of things. And I'm not going to tell you my call story now. You've heard it. Many of you have heard it. Sometime you'll hear it again. So pastors are called. Now's the join-in part. When we think about people who are called to vocations or activities or things, who else do we think about? Who do you think about as being called to something?
First responders.
First responders. They put their lives on the line every day for us. That's a calling. That's not something that many people do for the money or the fame. They do it because they're called to do it. Okay, who else? In our community today that are called. Where? Military people. Sure.
Doctors.
Say it louder.
Doctors.
Doctors, nurses,
Teachers.
teachers. Teachers, I believe. I'm looking at a few teachers around here. I know that teachers are called because none of you are doing it for the money. And none of you are doing it because it's easy. You're doing it because you're called to love on those children and to bring them up in the ways that they ought to be brought up and to learn them good. Who else is called in our society? Caregivers, people that professionally give care, but not only people that professionally give care, people that give care to their loved ones are called. Here's the thing about being called. We think of, it's only special kind of things that we're called to. But God calls us. God calls us to be insurance salesmen. God calls us to be piano players and photographers. God calls us to be engineers and architects. God calls us to be ditch diggers and street sweepers and the list obviously can go on and on and on and on. God calls us like God called Samuel in the middle of the night. Samuel, Samuel. He says, "Here I am, Lord." Like the song that we started our worship service with. "I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me." And I think that's the one word in that whole song that I would change. If you lead me, but when you lead me. Because God calls each of us to something. To multiple things. He calls us to something new every day. He's called the bond to raise these beautiful children. And he calls her every day to wake up. and to take care of these beautiful children. God calls Vicki and Ken to go down the hill 4 or 5 times a week and babysit a grandchild. And that's a calling, to be there and to be with those children. But it's not just God calling us to be with our grandchildren and those type of things. Not everybody has a grandchild that they can be close with. Not everybody has a child that they're raising. But God calls us to recognize that we, like Samuel, are children of God. Called to simply get up and say, what is it, Lord? What is it for today? What are you calling me to do? Maybe it's simply to hand $1 to somebody out in front of 7-Eleven. Maybe tomorrow it's to go over to Grace Resource Center and volunteer. Maybe if you're not able to do any of those things, it's to spend an extra hour in prayer for people that have been hurt by the hurricanes and shootings and fires. But hear this. We are all called. Called to be children of God. To make this world a better place. Amen. Let's stand.